I think so many times people have this belief that you need money to travel to, yeah, okay, I'll just use the example of travel, right? Because that's something that you hear a lot of people think, oh, you need to have a certain level of money or something to travel. And I always just say that when I was 17 and about to enter university, now, I had an education fund saved for me, right? So I didn't necessarily have to pay for school at all. And I just lived at home. So I had like no expenses. And so my concept of money was really quite like non-existent in a sense, just because I've never lived on my own at that time. I'd never traveled on my own. I never really had to buy anything on my own. And I wasn't really even given like an allowance per se. I always just kind of had money in a sense. And and then when I went to university, I I tell the story in my second podcast about how it was not in alignment for me, and I felt that very distinctly and clearly. Like the clues were there, how I was feeling, like the signs and messages, but I didn't quite understand, like, to correlate that with the fact that, okay, I should just walk away from this and to have that self trust and to have that conviction almost to be like, okay, I trust that my body, my inner wisdom, my inner compass is pointing me away from this decision. And I can trust that in itself to walk away from this. But I didn't have that at the time, right? And I also did not necessarily have the awareness of like how how your inner compass points you towards what your path is and how that then attracts the resources in a sense. So even though I had the resources in the sense of like, okay, I had this fund saved for me to go to university, because it wasn't aligned, I never was like in that attraction phase of just drawing things to me. My mind was always telling me like quit, withdraw, just leave. And like this wasn't a thing where it's like, oh, it's just getting harder and you just need to dig deeper. This was not it at all. Like it was literally a mismatch, a misalignment with my inner compass. And so what this has to do with, thinking that you need money to travel. So let me say fast forward. I complete this university degree. Like the whole time I'm there, I never like had to pay for anything in a sense. And I lived at home the entire time that I was doing this university degree, right? So now I'm like, oh, I need to get a job maybe. But fact is that I always just had like money given to me in a sense, like in my account, and like I never really had to worry about that. Um, and the corollary to that is that I never really had huge desires that I felt called to either. And I would just say, I was very content with just say being around my hometown and like, going to nearby places and even just, the odd holiday here or there. And like, I wouldn't even buy my own shampoo. Like, like, I didn't really do anything for myself in terms of spending money. So then fast forward when I'm like in this feeling of misalignment and I'm like cycling through all these different jobs and I'm like, you know what? I'm just feeling like I need to do something that I'm actually called to. And at some point I do Vipassana. I talk about that in my first podcast. And I do that and I suddenly feel like this feeling of I can trust myself. I can allow myself to just flow and not to always try to fit myself into a certain box or idea, and also to just let things be easy because I'm like at this point it's like I've already spent 4 years in university. Now I'm like maybe 1 or 2 years outside of university and I'm just kind of bouncing from job to job, right? And the thing is like obviously I could just do the same thing that I did when I was in university and just plod on and just finish the dang thing. But because I had that experience and I realized how little that came of that experience, right? Finishing something does not mean that it was worthwhile. Just because you work hard does not mean that it's worthwhile. Like there's this misconception in society that working hard is like noble or something or somehow. But I'm telling you right now, if it's not in alignment with who you really are, There's like it's just like a non-question. Like I would not even, knowing what I know now, I would not have even had that notion like you just need to work hard or just continue or just finish it just because then you can say you did. Like for me, there was a lot of FOMO with me, like every year after year completing that degree, because it's like I would not just allow myself to have that space of like unknown, of like, okay, I don't know. It's like a void, right? So I had always had that feeling like a semester, even like from semester to semester, even week by week. I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna drop out now. Just stop doing this like nonsense that I just felt like I was just totally not on point. But I just continued going. And a lot of it was just this fear of like the unknown, like this void of like, okay, what am I going to do if I just do nothing? And I think, and there was also like quite a lot of external pressure that like, okay, we have this fund for you. You have to go, like, just use it, like, just complete it. And it wasn't, there's not like a lot of space to be like, okay, well, if you're not happy, if you're not aligned, then don't do it, right? Or give yourself that space. So there's not a lot of that. And that was where I didn't really have that. I didn't really hold that ability at that time to give myself that allowance to be like, if there's something calling you somewhere else, you don't necessarily have to know what. All you need to know is that right now you're being called to just withdraw from this program or just give yourself the space to not be there. And in hindsight, that's really would have been the smarter thing to do, not just plod on or, work hard, so to speak, or just do something for the sake of doing it. And okay, let me get back to this idea of like, okay, you need money to travel. Because, okay, so, a lot of times you're going to school because you're thinking, I need to make a living, right? I mean, is that not why people go to school? Like in my head, though, I never really had that true feeling because as I mentioned, I never felt called there. So it was almost like this detachment from like, oh yeah, at some point, obviously, the whole reason that you're here is that you're trying to get some kind of like a livelihood, right? Or you're training yourself for something. But because my mindset didn't honestly work in that linear thinking, or like I didn't have that, like my mind was always just elsewhere. It's just like my mind did not operate in that fashion, right? So fast forward, obviously, that's why I'm out of university. I have this degree, but I'm not necessarily like on that track of like, let me just go get a job now and just a career that I'm in and I'm just making a living. Like I was just never like feeling that. And so no surprise that I would obviously be bouncing from thing to thing and like just not really taking anything seriously because I'm like, I'm not bored. I'm not on board with that spiritually. Like honestly, on a soul level, I'm just like so it's such a misalignment and it's a feeling of dis-ease, right? It's just such a dis-ease. So I'm like, finally, just, surrender, this concept of surrender. It's like, you know what? Just freaking hell. It's like just so much tension there where you're trying so hard to be something that you're not or do something that you're not even called to that at some point I did just have to surrender. I think I was like 23 or something. I was like, oh my God, it's so tiring. It's just so tiring. That's what happens when you're putting so much effort towards something that's like futile. It feels futile. It feels like the hamster wheel, right? And at some point I just relaxed. I'm like, it's not that I wasn't relaxed. Like most of the time I was like barely doing anything, but I was so in such a state of tension because I was doing things that were not aligned. So even though I was not necessarily, like I mentioned, like had everything paid for, it's not like I was necessarily busy per se or really actually stressed. I was stressed on a soul level. Like I was spiritually distressed. And so fast forward, I'm like 23, 24, and I finally like allow a bit of a surrender. I'm just kind of like, let me just go try out a few jobs. Like I've never had really any jobs prior to that. Like I try out some baking, I work in like greenhouses, I do like some more administrative type things, For me, I just wanted this variety. It's like I just wanted to try a variety of different things. I felt like I hadn't really done anything in life really, other than just go to school or something. So I then if you go back to my other podcast, the first one, I talk a bit about how I came to be in Vipassana. And that was a little bit of like I was surrendering more to an intuition. My intuitive mind kind of like came through and I kind of just found myself magically. It felt like this thing just kind of manifested or just appeared, something that I never really consciously thought of. And then I allowed myself, like I had been more in a state of surrender where I was willing to just go with the flow and to just walk away from things at this point, right? So I had kind of grown from the times I was at university. Now at this point, I'm I come back from that Vipassana retreat, right? And also further changed. I'm like, you know what? I'm walking away from this employment because it's not right for me. And that's the thing. So many people will almost like guilt you or make you feel like you're a bad person, or like they'll make you feel like, oh, you just you can't keep a job, or you can't like, you're not a hard worker, or you just you're too all these like, you're delusional, you're this and this. Like, trust me, I've heard all these things, and a lot of times they came from relatives and family members and freaking people like that, right? So that is often, it's just such a common theme. It's like these are the kind of things that you can't listen to if your soul is calling you to something else. And I only wish that I had listened sooner when I was 17, right? Because I heard that voice at 17 and I just didn't necessarily listen to it. So then I'm going on and I start just taking other roles that are actually even more outside of my comfort. At one point, I did like door to door sales. And this was actually like, this was one of my favorite experiences, actually, of any job I'd ever held or had. This was the most like 100% commission door to door sales, like 12-hour days. And maybe like my next podcast, I'll go more into that story. But that experience was more in alignment with me than any other like wage or salary or like, let me just say, boring ass situation or role that really did not feel like I was growing or doing anything of meaning. For me, something like that really showed me more of who I am and what I'm more drawn to. Like, I also learned from that experience that not many people actually even can do something like that. Um, Whereas I actually was quite good at it. Like, I actually made money from that. When a lot of people, like half of them would not show up the next time, or they would make like literally $0, or they just gave up like halfway through or something. I don't know. It just kind of showed me that like I'm more in alignment with something that requires more of you, where you have to be a bit more of a creator and create something from nothing, right? It's like you have to do something to get something. And it's easier. I mean, rather than just kind of like sitting and like, something where you just get paid regardless of what you actually do. Like, I never felt truly connected to something like that. Like, I can't really explain why, but it's like I think that's one of the reasons that I was just job hopping, because I always felt it was so, I don't know, just something about it was so passive in a sense. It just didn't feel like it was like, I feel like I'm a very creative person, and it's like I needed something, like it's almost like I'm an entrepreneur at heart, essentially. Like, when I was younger, I would do like go door to door, like shoveling people's snow for money, or like lemonade stands, like garage sales, like all those type of things, right? I'm like a very entrepreneurial type of person at core anyway. And I'd always like invent games and like try to modify things and like just make things different than they already are. So that already shows like I'm not someone who is very easily just kind of fits into something that's already there, or that wants to necessarily operate from a structure that already exists. Like, I always feel like I just want to almost like create from nothing, which is why this door to door sales was almost like closer to who I actually am as a person, and just the way that I operate and just the way that I think, and what energizes me and enthusiasms me. Like, in those 12-hour days, like I would feel more energized at the end of the day than like a freaking 7-hour day just sitting freaking on a chair or something, right? So that already says a lot about it, about me. And so, at this point, then I realized like I am quite an active person. Like, I like being active, and I don't necessarily want to be driven around everywhere, which is really what's been happening prior to that. And I like making my own decisions. So it's like I felt like I really started becoming my own person more so than I had ever been, say, when I was going through university or just living at home and whatnot, or just like working very passive jobs. And the word job already just kind of gives me a headache. It sounds like the very kind of thing where it's like you need to be told what to do, you need to be delegated, whatever. Whereas like I like to be the one delegating. I like to be the one like telling people what to do. I like to be the one almost like self-directing myself in a sense, and like I mentioned, going to door and like having a little bit more of that, like you get nothing if you do nothing kind of thing. um, which is also why like I just never felt like I could get along with anyone if I was like at like sometimes like people who work at jobs, they're, I mean, maybe I won't get into that, but sometimes it's just like the mindset is a little bit different, right? It's like there's a little bit of a mm, woe is me attitude, or like, oh, I just need to get a like, a very functional, practical, utilitarian type of mindset. Whereas I've always just been like, yeah, but what are we actually doing here? Like, really? So this is why, like, the door to door sales, like, scared me at first. And by the time I actually went and did like my first whole day, I was like so enthusiastic. Like my confidence just soared. I don't know. It was just, I was like, oh my God, I love this. And at that point, I'm like, I'm never going back to like one of those 9 to 5 jobs or like a job where you just kind of do the same thing each day or you're not really feeling alive, right? I just never felt alive in any of those positions. Whereas with door to door, I always felt like so like it was so connected to something deeper within me. And I'll probably get into that more in like another podcast because I have so much to talk about with that experience. Um, but going on. So then at this time, I start realizing like, wow, freaking outside for like freaking 12-hour days. Sometimes it's raining. Sometimes you're just like, you just have like a backpack on you. You just like literally like the whole experience was just one that you just really get outside of your comfort zone if you've never done anything like that, right? And you're kind of just relying on yourself the whole day, essentially. Like you're not just tucked away inside like a building. And you really have to put out yourself out there. And at this point, I'm like, start to become more physically fit instead of just being driven everywhere. I'm like, I'm gonna bike. I'm gonna start biking more. And I started biking. Like before that, I would scarcely ride like more than maybe 20 minutes, half an hour at a time, and I would be like out of breath or something. And just because I've been be driven everywhere, right? And like I was always skinny, but it doesn't mean you're fit or healthy or for that matter, right? I mean, like as a kid, I always like biked around the neighborhood, but at some point in your adulthood, it's just a different situation. You're not just out with your friends, like biking around the neighborhood, just exploring. You're a little bit more like, okay, let me just bike here. And then that's when you realize you're not that fit. And so at this point, after I had started doing this door-to-door sales thing where I was like getting super fit from all that physical like exercise during the day, essentially, being outside all day and like walking around a lot and rain or shine or whatnot, that I also just started getting on my bike more, just like going around the river valley. And I would go for like 2, 3 hour bike rides sometimes during the day and just like go very long distance, even like bike on the highway and like going to like nearby towns on my bike. Like that's how long I would bike for. And I suddenly realized that like these distances became a lot shorter the more I did it, right? It's like your concept of what distances are, it's very subjective. And that's when I also then started going to other cities and exploring on my own. And then I would ride my bike in different cities and go also long distance bike rides. And I basically just started in my hometown where I started like going on these 2 to 3 hour bike rides and like on an almost daily basis. I think I just found myself enjoying being outside of like the four walls of a building a lot. And just that feeling of also appreciating nature more and the outdoors and being like in various landscapes and that feeling of exploration. So every time I would kind of like visit somewhere new or like explore a new part of town. And then along the way, I would kind of stop at little cafes I've never really visited before, even little shops and like neighborhoods. It's like I basically combed through the whole city like a fine tooth comb during this period of my life. So it's like I know my hometown like inside and out just because I would go around on my bike, not even like driving, right? You don't see as much, I don't think, in a car as when you're like on a bike and you get to go into all the nooks and crannies and like up and down and like into the river valleys and this and that. And I really explored like a lot of the city that way. And then when I would find myself in like different cities where I would become a lot more, extroverted, almost like I became less of a navel gazing type of situation where I was just kind of like mostly at home or like playing games or like, just like more homebody stuff. And I really became more outdoorsy. And I would go to other cities and I would also do the same thing. I would start combing them like a fine tooth comb, like going to all the like different places, mostly like by bike or even just by bus. Like I would rarely drive, right? Because I'd already had the experience of being driven everywhere. Now I was kind of just exploring things on my own a little bit more. And I was also a lot more fit in that sense because I was just out more. And so this is really how it started, where I would just allow my natural inclinations to guide me or just to pull me or not even think about it, just go with it, right? And it came really from just not trying so much, essentially. And I've never thought about money in a sense. I was just kind of doing what came naturally. I was like, oh, well, and obviously if you're going somewhere and you're going here and there, it's like there are some expenses, but I never like did any budgeting. I was never like, oh, let me like make sure I have enough money for this. Like a lot of times I would maybe write down what I spent, but I never did it necessarily out ahead of time to be like, oh, I only have this amount. Like I've never thought in that limiting sense of like, I only have this amount to spend. I can only spend this amount. Um, I think also because I've never had a budget, so it, it just wasn't something that was necessity for me. But when I would just go to these places, I would have an idea of what I spent, and it's like I've never like felt like I had to splurge or like really be like buy something just for the sake of buying something. But if I felt drawn to something, I might be like, oh, maybe I'll go for a massage here, or maybe I'll try out this place, or I like if I went to a restaurant, like I would rarely like really like I never really thought of things. I think it's also because I never had that allowance type of thing, so I never really had to like financially plan anything in that sense. But it really allowed me to see that like a lot of these adventures, if I was drawn to them, I would just go and I wouldn't really think about like the money in the sense I think a lot of people do. And then, at some point I had gone to a lot of nearby cities, and then maybe like I went on like a 3-week road trip through the USA on my own and also did a lot of biking there. And that was one of my longer solo trips at the time. And then I also that this was like before I really went like overseas, like beyond just like North America, right? On my own. I've been overseas like with my family, but honestly on my own. So when I did like it's kind of just kept expanding. Like I just became more fit. I became more comfortable just being out and about on my own. I came a lot more explorational, like exploring different places and new ideas and new concepts, and a variety of just exposing myself to like a variety of different things, right? First in my hometown, then nearby cities. And then at some point, maybe like a year or two later, I suddenly got called to like go overseas. And that's like another story where like that, how that came about was also quite unplanned. Like when I went on my round the world trip that was like more than a year long, I didn't even necessarily plan that at all. Like it kind of just unfolded like step by step. And that was just me following my inclinations and what I was drawn to at any given moment. And that came from like being like, okay, I've already like I was like living in a city that I'd already lived in before. It was Vancouver. And I was like living there and I'd already like combed it through like a fine-tooth comb, like I had with many other cities by this point. This was like 2015 now. And I realized that I was getting this call to just go further. And I didn't really even know what that call was, but it kind of just happened. And that's a story for another time. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is that like me becoming like a world traveler and like going further and like, being so much more in tune with like where I'm called, this all came like it kind of just expanded as I went along. Like it started very small. It started with like a very small seed. It started like I was in university, driven everywhere, living at home. And then after that, I started like, you know, explore. I just started exploring. I went like through so many different jobs and experiences and roles and positions. And then, you know, came to Vipassana and then started doing a little bit of more exploring my own like in my hometown and nearby places and then just within like Canada and like nearby like North America and then at some point like I was called to go even more like internationally. And this was like 2015, 2016 at this point that I went on my round the world trip. And like imagine I never traveled solo on my own before that. And like literally just like what I don't even know if I would call it like a solo like a travel because I hadn't been thinking that I was traveling at the time. I was like I'm just living life and I'm just going where I feel called. So I never really planned it like I'm like oh I'm going on a backpacking trip, I'm going traveling. Like I never even thought about like I'm not going to budget because I it just unfolded along the way. Like I didn't even know all the places I was going to go ahead of time and I didn't even know it was going to come from it. So that's what I mean by like people think, oh, you need money to travel. And I would actually say that in my own experience, it's not that you need money to travel, it's that you need alignment to travel if you feel so called to do so. Because I've never been like, oh, I just want to go visit here. But even if you had an idea that you just want to visit somewhere, it's like, where's that idea coming from? Like that idea is obviously coming from somewhere, right? So that is a little bit of intuitive guidance. If you have a message or like a recurring thought, um, actually, that was one of the ones when I was called to go. abroad. Like prior to that, I was like, I had this recurring thought, and that's a story for another time. But what I'm trying to say is that when you're listening to your intuition, it will obviously give you some kind of guidance or a calling or a feel like a pull to something or somewhere. And when you simply put that as like the priority, like that feeling of alignment and what you just feel on an intrinsic level, like you're not doing something for the sake of doing something, or you're not doing something because of something you think you'll get from doing something, you're just doing it because it's just like an inner calling, it's like an inner pull, it's like you have an intrinsic desire, then suddenly you find yourself pulled by like a magnetic compass more than any external practicalities, say like, oh, how much money is this going to cost, right? I never really thought about that because it was not necessarily even like when I was in university, I didn't have to think of it just because. But at the same time, I also wasn't pulled to that. So like it was just a misalignment. But then when I came to do like the travel thing, it's like I didn't have necessarily money saved for me to like go travel like you would like an education fund, right? Yet somehow I had the resources, or like the resources would just come to me. And I also noticed that like the more money I spent when I traveled, like not like the more money I spent, but like even though I had spent like for a whole year of travel, that's like a five-figure amount, right? And when I came back, I actually found that I had made more money from some investments I had made then than I had actually made the whole time I was like freaking working these other jobs, right? Like obviously I made some money from the jobs I was working, but it always felt very like little in a sense. Like it also didn't feel in alignment. So it felt very like not difficult, but it just felt like oh, laborious, effortful, right? It felt like that lack of ease, that lack of peace, also, that just that lack of alignment. But then when I was traveling, I felt so aligned. I felt like, wow, like interesting. I felt like a magical adventure. And then, shortly after I returned, even though I had spent like a certain amount, I was also drawn to certain things, and I was just like in that place of like listening to that voice, and then I allowed that, followed that, and then that's what also like returned me the money I had spent, like twofold, threefold even. And it's interesting that because it's almost like the universe is guiding you to what is in alignment and will also support you with the resources to fulfill that alignment, and you really just have to go with it because you just living that life and that energetic state of alignment is what brings in the resources around it. And in fact, brings you more than what you had expended. And that is really what I mean by you don't necessarily need money to travel. You need alignment. You need a certain bit like you need the ability and the trust to follow your intuition and whatever your intrinsic desire is calling you to. So I would start with that. Start with your alignment and your inner compass and what that pulls you to. I've never used my degree. Whatever money was spent on that education, I've literally never used my degree. Like, all those jobs I had, like, I didn't necessarily need a degree to do those jobs. And I don't have any desire to work in the field that I studied in. And I haven't. Even I'm 37. I've literally never worked in the field that I studied. I never used my degree. And so what was that money for? Like that money did not return to me in that sense because it was not in alignment. Whereas when I went to travel, you would think like, then how did that money return to me through some investments that I then made, right? And that's why the universe works through energy because it's not about the practical, like, okay, well, yeah, you can go and do all the laborious, hardworking things, sure, but are you going to make the returns that you make when you just invest and that you move in alignment and then you just do what you're called to do? And then you're not even thinking about it, but then things just somehow unfold and work out and you're not really, making things happen. Like I'm not making things happen as I felt like when I was in school, I always felt like how to do stuff. But like now I'm kind of just like I'm just being. And that's really the difference. Like that's the core difference between being in alignment and not being in alignment. It doesn't necessarily take money to travel. It takes alignment and that intuitive flow to do what you really feel called to. that then brings in the money, the resources, the whatnot, the energy. So that was just a bit of a tidbit on how I came to be more in alignment, how I kind of started off before I started going further and further. And now I've been to more than 55 countries solo, but that was not the case. I was just kind of combing through my hometown at first. And, you know, I kind of cycled out of the whole working a job type of thing and then started becoming more of an investor and investing and then getting returns on those investments. The more I traveled, the more I would make. It's like, hello. So there's a certain energetic factor and like a magic in the world, especially when you're in tune with that inner compass and that alignment. It's like an inner compass. Like, think how satisfying it is when that compass is just like, you know, has that true north, just pointing at it, it just works. It's just an alignment. And that's what I wanted to share today.